exactly what is moral distress? We talk about moral distress and burnout almost as though they're synonyms, and they certainly go together. But let's drill down a little bit to make sure that we have a working definition of moral distress, at least to help us understand it for ourselves and our coworkers, right? So, what is moral distress? Well, in 1984, Andrew Jameson defined moral distress as a phenomenon in which one knows the right action to take, but is constrained from taking it. So I know what I think I should do, but for some reason, either internally or externally, I'm constrained from doing. I can't do it. Let's talk about moral injury then a little bit. A historical definition. A VA psychiatrist, Jonathan Shea, coined the term moral injury in the 1990s. So a relatively recent phrase. The VA says that moral injury can occur in response to acting or witnessing. So either I'm doing it or I'm seeing it done. Acting or witnessing behaviors that go against an individual's values and moral beliefs. So I'm doing something that contradicts how I actually feel, think, believe, or I'm witnessing those things. Here's my definition of moral distress. Moral distress occurs when you take an action or witness an action that violates your personal values. So you're doing something or watching something that violates your personal values. And when sudden or profound, so it happens just in a moment's time, you're doing something or witnessing something that transgresses your values, or it's just really profound for you, and no one else gets to define profound. You get to define profound. Moral injury can occur in those situations. So let's talk a little bit about burnout. So that's moral injury, seeing or doing something that transgresses your internal belief system, values, morals, etc. Let's talk about burnout. So the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, holds that healthcare coworker burnout is one of his top priorities. He issued, in fact, a 76-page advisory. I thought some of my papers in school were long and difficult. A 76-page advisory on this topic in 2021, about halfway through the first years of the pandemic. He says burnout is characterized by a high degree of emotional exhaustion. I don't know about you, but just that phrase, emotional exhaustion, connected so deeply when I read it. And depersonalization or cynicism, sarcasm in some cases, and a low sense of personal accomplishment. Like I'm not sure how much I'm really contributing at work anymore. My definition of burnout is a little simpler. When someone talks about coworker engagement in your workplace, or they talk about compassionate care, and you feel a wave of nostalgia remembering when you used to really be engaged in those topics, you might be burnt out. In other words, if compassion in the workplace, being engaged with your job feels like something you remember in the past instead of experience presently, you just might be burnt out. Or when you've run out of cares to give, when you just don't have it in you to really care anymore, you might be burnt out. So do you remember when we all went to a zero visitor policy in our hospitals in 2020? Well, I recommended that we adopt a zero visitor policy a little bit before our senior executive team was ready to do so. They asked me to survey the ethics committee, which I lead, and so I did, and we had a unanimous response that it was time for our health system to go to this zero visitor policy. But still, the senior executives weren't convinced, and they delayed following suit with really the rest of the country for a short period of time. But of course, in those days, a day felt like a long time. This experience was an example of moral distress for me in at least three different ways. For one, I believed that if the ethics committee made a unanimous recommendation, that it should be followed by our senior executives. In fact, it had been followed in the past and highly regarded. And when there was a small delay in that, it caused an ounce of moral distress for me. Number two, I just felt badly about making the decision, about making the recommendation of saying, I don't think we should have any visitors right now. It violated my morals, my values. I could rationalize it. I could understand the logic behind it, but I still felt badly about making that recommendation. And then a year or two later, our state actually passed a law saying that would never be allowed again. We'd never be allowed to have a zero visitor policy. And so moral distress came back up for me when I realized that the decision I had recommended and advocated for and talked about a lot during that time now would be illegal. So what I had done would now be considered illegal. So again, my definition of moral distress occurs when you take an action or witness an action that violates your personal values. So I was taking an action and then subsequently witnessing an action over and over when we were saying no to people coming into the hospital that really violated my values. My values said family and friends ought to be able to be there, especially at the end of life for loved ones, and we were even saying no in those situations. When these experiences of moral distress are sudden and or profound, moral injury can occur. And I would say this was a pretty profound, not necessarily, I mean, it felt sudden at the time, but it was over the course of several weeks. But certainly a profound experience of moral distress, and so moral injury may have occurred. A different example, an ethics example from a case we had way before COVID even arrived. We had an elderly and a frail patient. Unfortunately, this story may sound familiar for many of you who've worked in critical care hospitals. An elderly patient, she was in frail shape, she had necrosis of the brain. She wasn't brain dead, but parts of her brain were dying. She had metastasized cancer, all through her body, all sorts of bad stuff. She'd been nonverbal for weeks, not really able to talk with the care team or her family, multi-organ failure, she's vent dependent, and yet her family demanded that she be kept as a full code. So we had this patient in this extreme state near the end of her life, and yet because of the code status, our nurses, doctors, techs, and others on the floor knew that if this patient lost her pulses, they would have to do CPR on such an elderly and frail patient. And guess what? That's exactly what happened. This elderly, frail patient with so many different things, her body contracting and everything else, her pulses went out, and because she was a full code, the ethical thing to do at that time was to follow through on those wishes and to code her. So for 47 minutes, this patient received CPR with her bones cracking and breaking, with no real hope. Even if we had restored her heart rhythm, all the other problems were still going to be in play. She was still going to be a very sick person near the end of her life. And her granddaughter stood in the corner in agony, crying and overwhelmed. Our nurses, tears running down their eyes. This was an experience of moral distress and moral injury. Remember that definition. Moral distress occurs when you take an action or you witness an action that violates your personal values. So I know, because I heard it as the ethics chairperson, I know from those nurses, they did not want to do CPR. They felt that was the wrong thing to do, that it was not medically indicated in this case. And they were right. And we've taken some steps to make sure something like this doesn't happen again. But because it happened that one time, those nurses and those doctors, and certainly the granddaughter and other family members of this patient, carry that with them still today. So when these things are sudden or profound, moral injury can occur, and I'm certain that some of our nurses experienced moral injury from that situation. So again, the Surgeon General, 76-page advisory. You remember what a big deal it was. Surgeon General warnings on the packs of different things, on packages of different things. A 76-page warning on healthcare coworker burnout. Like many of you, during especially the early months, years of the pandemic, I found myself always on, working on the weekends, taking calls outside of work hours for sure. On Sunday mornings, I remember a Sunday morning being in my basement early, and I was trying to do some work that wasn't necessarily associated with my job, and my little Microsoft Teams thing popped up with a question from a coworker. This was part of how we lived for quite a while. And it's always been somewhat a part of healthcare, but it certainly was exacerbated during the pandemic. Working on policies in the evenings, adjusting workflows, supporting our incident command center, things that many of you either did or saw your coworkers do during that time. So burnout. Dr. Murthy says burnout is characterized by a high degree of emotional exhaustion and depersonalization or cynicism, with a low sense of personal accomplishment at work, where you don't feel like you're really making the difference that you used to make, or you're depersonalizing. You're not really thinking of the people in bed or the people coming through the door as people anymore. Well, by the fall of 2022, I was beyond emotionally exhausted. One of my teams during the pandemic had responded to 5,563 patient deaths. Not all of them COVID, obviously, but that experience of COVID certainly increased and inflated our numbers. Leadership conflict had cropped up in new ways and as a result of the pandemic, and even on the backside of some of our highest waves. I'd taken meetings on the weekends for years, interrupting my time away from work and with my family. I remember being out of town at one of my kids' sporting events, and standing about 100 yards away from where he's playing rugby on the phone in a meeting with other leaders on a Sunday afternoon. And this was sort of the norm for quite a while. I left social media during that time, said goodbye to Facebook. It was just a source of distress for me, and the work that I had enjoyed for so long was killing me. On my 44th birthday in the fall of 2022, I woke up with an irregular heartbeat for the first time in my life. My Apple Watch told me, yeah, you may be experiencing an irregular heartbeat and AFib. I went into the hospital and they confirmed what my watch and my personal experience was telling me, that my heart was not right. And the doctor came in and sat down, and here I am, I'm just a couple stories up below where my office is at the hospital. And the doctor looks me in the eye and he says, well, what we often do for patients in your situation, first onset of AFib, you're in the first 24 hours of the experience, is we administer shock. And I thought he was joking. It makes sense now as I look back about it. But when I was in that moment and I heard him say, we want to shock you like we do when people are having a heart attack, when I'm laying there talking, not feeling great, but feeling pretty much normal, I said to him, I said, you're joking, right? He did not smile. He did not laugh. He said, no, this is probably the best next step for you, is to get your heart back in rhythm. So usually we sedate people like this. I said, well, usually tell me about why you would or you wouldn't. So we talked through the indications or contraindications on whether or not it was necessary for me to be sedated. I chose to not be sedated, which a lot of people thought was an insane choice, but got to experience 225 joules of shock to my chest, wide awake. And boy, if I was wide awake before, I was definitely wide awake after. It was definitely a shocking experience, excuse the pun, but my heart went back into rhythm, and of course had all the follow-up and everything afterwards. A few weeks later, I was meeting with my regular doctor, and he diagnosed me with depression for the first time in my life. So in less than a month, on the backside, I guess what's the backside, for me at least, what I consider the backside of the pandemic, I experienced a medical complication I never encountered, and a mental health complication that I'd never experienced before. Diagnosed with depression, my counselor concurred, speculated that the emotional stress, the emotional exhaustion, and burnout had led to these medical issues, and the two were likely connected. I'm not telling you anything new. You didn't click play on this video or log on today to be told that moral distress and burnout are common in healthcare. Newsflash, right? But what do we do? I'd like to propose two pathways through or out of moral distress and burnout for professionals. A roadmap, if you will, for how do we, and kind of two roadmaps, two guides, two pathways through and out of this experience that you and I have had, and so many of our colleagues have had, of moral distress and burnout. These two pathways I call the rational pathway. We're going to talk about that one first, and these are of equal importance. The rational pathway, and then second of all, the non-rational pathway. So let's talk about the rational pathway first. We're going to cover a lot of things fairly quickly, not in a whole lot of depth. The first step in the rational pathway is an opportunity for our coworkers to opt out of situations where they feel moral distress. This has a long history in healthcare of allowing certain people or coworkers in certain situations to say, this goes against my morals and values, and so I'd like to opt out. This is very important for any healthcare system, to give you and your coworkers an opportunity to say, look, I see why this is happening, but I can't really be a part of it, and so I'm going to step aside. Now, it's important that healthcare is still available for that person, that we don't remove the opportunity for healthcare, but it's important that our coworkers can opt out, in situations where they're experiencing moral distress. Second, taking a time out is something that we need to regularly encourage. To take a step back, a step out, to get out of the fray for a little while. Timeouts can be one step on the rational pathway through moral distress and burnout. The next, and probably the most important one, is leaders who listen. Some of us, when we got into positions of leadership, we thought that it was our job to tell. It is not. It is our job to listen, to hear what's really going on in the hearts and minds of both our younger coworkers and our veterans that we work alongside. Leaders who listen can help decompress what's going on inside for our coworkers. Next, well-being programs. Programs that address these inner topics, everything from meditation classes to tokens of appreciation, that sort of thing. A well-being program is not going to solve anyone's mental health crisis. However, the lack of a well-being program does communicate there's not a system or a structural value of those coworkers. And then there's got to be non-punitive ways. So we're on, if you're keeping score at home, we're on number 5 of the steps in the path through the rational pathway through moral distress and burnout. We've got to have non-punitive ways for people to say that they're struggling. People are afraid in healthcare, in any professional environment, to say, I'm not okay. I'm not sure I can come back next shift. I'm not sure I can do this thing again that has caused me so much distress in the past. So we've got to have a pathway that people aren't just told this is non-punitive, but they believe. They actually believe they're not going to be in trouble if they say they're struggling through this channel. And then we've got to have non-punitive error reporting when mistakes are made, and mistakes will be made. We've got to have a way for people to raise their hand, to see something, to say something, to report anonymously, and be able to say things aren't going the way that they should go, and that they should have no fear of retribution. Next, peer-to-peer support. Nurses supporting nurses, techs supporting techs, doctors supporting doctors. Peer-to-peer support, both formal, maybe a program that formalizes that and says this is how you access peer-to-peer support, and informal, just a culture where we're supporting one another, is a rational step out of moral distress and burnout. Next, I don't know what number we're on now, maybe 9, a culture, a system-wide culture that recognizes the global problems. Whether you're a part of a small practice or a huge national conglomerate, a culture that says we recognize that in the world there are problems of moral distress, moral injury, and burnout for healthcare coworkers. And then secondly, or 10th maybe here, a culture that acknowledges local problems. One ER doctor, when she quit in the middle of the pandemic, said sarcastically, and sarcasm is a gift of many of ours in healthcare, she said, if my distress had been acknowledged locally, if someone in my organization had said, we see that you're struggling and we're sorry that you're struggling, she said, I could have been miserable at my job for maybe 11 more years. So had there been local acknowledgement of the stress that she was experiencing, she felt as though she would have continued. She may have still been miserable, but she probably would not have resigned her post as an ER physician. Next, on the rational pathway through moral distress and burnout, provide the necessary tools for the job. When the EMR and the reimbursement models are working against you, that just exacerbates moral distress, burnout, emotional exhaustion, and fatigue. A gratitude journal is not going to fix a situation where she's just constantly frustrated with the EMR. These well-being program pieces that are important are not going to address these tools that are problems. Next, reasonable workloads, whatever that looks like. And you've got to allow people, coworkers on the front lines, whether that's clinical coworkers and non-clinical coworkers, to say this is reasonable, this is unreasonable, and this is how I'm experiencing the workload. And then confidential counseling has to be easily accessible, whether that's through a tool like an app or an on-demand resource or something that's in person and on-site. Let's talk now about system responses. Some systems increase moral distress. So we talked about the EMR, but there's lots of systems that happen within our healthcare entities. if these systems exacerbate exhaustion and frustration, you're going to lead more to moral distress and burnout and have less engaged coworkers, and coworkers are quitting right and left. But there are systems that can alleviate moral distress. That peer-to-peer confidential support system can decompress the emotional exhaustion felt by healthcare workers in ways that even professional counseling aren't going to be able to achieve. I said it earlier, I'm going to say it again because I think it's so important. The most key rational response to healthcare workers who are in moral distress and burnout is leaders who listen. If you're a leader here, you've had an experience where a coworker came to you, something happened that they didn't feel good about, they did it or they watched it, but they felt guilty about what had happened, and they told you, and you were able to not just give them a rational answer, but as a leader, you were able to exhibit care for them, maybe forgiveness for what they had done, certainly accountability. We work in an industry that requires accountability, but sometimes as leaders, we have to say, you're okay. I forgive you. I know you were doing the best you can, and I hear what you're saying, and I will take it to heart. Leaders who listen is the most important step on the rational path out of and through moral distress and burnout. Moral distress, moral injury, and burnout, these things are unfair. They are unjust. They feel wrong because they are wrong. They happen to good people who want to do good work, being thrust into bad situations over and over and over. These are also common experiences, though. It is more the norm than the exception. So allow me to share a few unnecessary statistics because I'm sure you already understand it experientially. A survey of the Association of Critical Care Nurses says that a staggering 92% of critical care nurses said the pandemic would shorten their careers. So nearly every nurse they surveyed said, yeah, because I've worked during COVID, I'm probably not going to have as long of a career as a nurse. That's staggering. Depending on the survey you read, between 18 and 25% of healthcare workers have quit their job since the beginning of the pandemic, with more of them leaving the industry, not just that job and going to another job as a nurse or as a respiratory therapist or something like that, but actually leaving the industry and saying, I'm not going to work in healthcare anymore. An article by The Atlantic called Why Healthcare Workers Are Quitting in Droves says that between 35 and 54% of American nurses and physicians were already feeling burnt out before the pandemic arrived. So if you're feeling burnt out before the worldwide pandemic arrives, imagine where you are now. All the research pointed to two common themes. One, nurses are affected by moral distress and burnout more than any other discipline, more profoundly than any other job. However, the second common theme is that all disciplines are affected. So nurses might be affected most profoundly, but there's no discipline that escapes scot-free. Every discipline in healthcare is experiencing moral distress and burnout. One more study before we move on. An international study by the Journal of Occupational Medicine and Toxicology found that 44% of Australian nurses are experiencing high emotional exhaustion. 66%, so 2/3 of U.S. nurses are experiencing high levels of burnout, and 63% of Canadian nurses are experiencing high emotional exhaustion. So around 2/3 of our nurses, it could easily be said, are burnt out. That's a staggering number of our nurses, an overwhelming majority. Well, let's get really serious and ask ourselves the question, what if we get this wrong? What if we don't figure out pathways, roadmaps through and out of moral distress and burnout? What's the cost? Well, quantitatively, the Surgeon General believes that we will experience a shortage of between 54,000 and 139,000 physicians. So imagine being 100,000 physicians short by the year 2033, just 10 years from now. That those 92% of RNs who said the pandemic stresses would shorten their career are going to start to realize that and quit their jobs. If we don't get this right, a lack of access to health care for our citizens, deterioration of the healthcare workforce in the United States becomes a more real thing every day. Coworker disengagement, so moving from the quantitative to the qualitative, coworkers are going to be disengaged. Your family members are going to be taken care of in a hospital by nurses who don't care as much as they used to because of their experience. Not because they're bad people, but because of their experience of moral distress and burnout. You're going to experience a lack of empathy, not only caretaker to patient, but also among coworkers. We're going to have higher costs. There's going to be more errors. Burnout and moral distress and personal disengagement are associated with a higher number of errors in healthcare. PTSD, being totally disengaged. Depression among our coworkers. Absenteeism. And most scary of all, suicide. We already know that physicians as an occupation rank the highest for suicide. Certainly this experience is not going to help those numbers. So we've talked about the rational path through and out of moral distress and burnout. Now let's discuss the non-rational path. Because lots of people are talking about the long list that I just went through, from leaders who listen to a well-being program, etc. Let's talk about the non-rational path. The piece that so many of us have missed and so many programs have overlooked as they've thought about how to help us with moral distress and burnout. The non-rational path has one step. The one step of the non-rational path is self-forgiveness. Forgiving yourself for those things that caused you moral injury. Because remember, what's our definition of moral injury? Doing or seeing something that transgresses, that violates your personal values. Have you violated your own values by choice or by force? Have you had experiences like I described for myself where I recommended things that I didn't really value in my heart? Have you stood as witness when your values were violated by others around you or by a system that was put into place? Have you been forced to or chosen to work yourself beyond the point of exhaustion and burnout? We cannot rationalize away your feelings. If you're feeling guilty, if you're feeling burdened, if you're feeling pulled down by those experiences, no amount of rationalizing them away is going to fix the situation. See, no matter how many times I tell that ICU nurse that it wasn't her fault that she had to do chest compressions and break ribs on that frail and elderly patient, she's still going to feel badly about it. Am I right that she had no choice? Yes, 100%. Can it be rationalized? Is it logical to say she only did what she was required to do at that time? Certainly. No matter how many times I tell myself that I did the best I could with the information that we had at the time when I recommended 0 visitors in our facility back in 2020, I still don't feel good about it. You see, logic is no match for moral distress. Logic, rationalizing away, cannot erase our experiences of moral distress. So the non-rational path is self-forgiveness. Self-forgiveness. What if I can forgive myself? Forgiving myself instead of just taking another yoga class or writing in my gratitude journal or telling myself to get over it. Forgiving myself does 2 things. First of all, it affirms my values. It says the fact that you didn't want to bar and lock the door and say, I know we've got a dying elderly man inside and here's his wife and kids on the outside who really want to be in. It says that it's the right thing, that I feel like that was bad. It affirms my values. It allows me to keep my belief system intact when I decide that I can forgive myself, because it says, you know what? That was bad. That was maybe even wrong to do at that point in time. Or at the very least, it transgressed, it violated my personal values. Forgiving myself, instead of rationalizing the situation, allows me to keep my values in place. Even though I did CPR on that patient, a nurse could say, I could still believe that it was the wrong thing to do when I choose the non-rational path of self-forgiveness. So, number one, self-forgiveness affirms my values. And number two, forgiveness affirms my value as a human being. It says, I still have value. I am not my transgression. I am not that worst thing that I've done or watched happen. I'm not the chaplain who prohibits visitors because he's mean spirited. I'm not the doctor who doesn't listen to family, or the nurse who prolongs the dying patient and breaks ribs doing CPR for a patient who's going to die anyway. I'm not that person. I'm not identified with that because I can forgive myself for that action or that witnessing. I'm a person who cares about what is right, who adds value to the care we provide, and I am worth forgiving. Moral distress, friends, cannot dim your dignity. It cannot. Moral distress cannot demote your value or decrease your value, cannot wash away your worth. No amount of rationalizing or logic is going to heal my soul, but self-forgiveness can. And friends, I've had to take my own medicine. I had to sit down years into the pandemic and write out things I wish I had not done, things I wish I had not been forced to do, things I wished I had not seen. And I had to say, I forgive myself. I'm sorry I had to do these things, but I can forgive myself. If you can't forgive yourself yet, let me tell you, you are worthwhile. You have so much dignity, so much value. You have such an important role to play in the lives of those in your personal life, and in the lives of patients and coworkers when you come to work. You can be, in fact, you are forgiven for your worst moments. You are not defined by them. They cannot dim your dignity. They cannot demote your value. They cannot wash away your worth. This is the non-rational path of self-forgiveness. So the roadmap includes two equally important paths. One is the rational, the things we must do, taking a time out, having non-punitive ways to do error reporting and to seek help, etc., etc. Systems that alleviate moral distress instead of increasing it, and leaders who listen, that rational path. And second of all, we've got to follow personally the non-rational path of self-forgiveness, affirming my values, but also, and more importantly, affirming my value.